On a frozen lake in Novgorod, slabs of glass like ice rose from the depths, and inside each one was a face, villagers who had disappeared that very morning. Their eyes stared blankly, their breaths frozen mid-exhale, and when the slabs began to melt from the inside, a foul mist poured out, smelling of old leather and decay. Entire streets of the town later appeared trapped beneath the ice, preserved like a stolen reflection. By dawn, the lake swallowed everything, leaving nothing but flawless ice and the echo of lives erased. Watch, if you dare, as Novgorod vanishes beneath the cold. The winter lake cracked open not from above, but from within, as though something buried in its black depths had grown restless beneath the suffocating crust of ice. The rupture began silently in the hour before dawn, when even the most vigilant dogs slept and the fires in the hearths thinned to pale embers. By the time the first villagers trudged toward the shore, guided only by the muffled glow of their lanterns, the lake's surface lay split into grotesque, gleaming ribs. These slabs, long and glassy, jutted upward at angles that defied the memory of any winter past. They carried a sheen no frost could conjure, polished smooth like the panes of a cathedral window, yet humming faintly with a cold so profound it stung the eyes and tightened the breath. Those who approached felt the air shift, as if drawn inward toward the slabs, pulled by an unseen hunger. Each exhale curled into the frigid morning but refused to drift away. Instead, it hung suspended before the villagers' faces, forming delicate spirals that trembled like uncertain spirits. The wind did not touch them. The frost did not claim them. They lingered in place, weightless and unwilling to vanish, as though the lake itself wished to keep every breath offered to it. Closer inspection revealed something more unsettling. Within each slab hovered faint shapes, pale and wavering, as if trapped in a dream that resisted waking. The villagers squinted, at first dismissing the shapes as tricks of the half-light. Yet the longer they stared, the more those blurred contours sharpened into features. The curved cheek of a weaver's niece, the knitted brow of a hunter who had not returned from the forest the previous night, the parted lips of a shepherd caught in a silent plea. These were faces known to them, familiar in the way of neighbors met daily at the well or along the muddy road to market. Each visage appeared frozen at the brink of some vanished moment, mid-breath or mid-step, captured with a precision too cruel to be natural. A few villagers reached out, driven by the instinct to touch, to confirm, to disprove. Their gloved fingers hovered inches from the icy surfaces, only to recoil as a sudden metallic tang surged through the air, sharp as blood on a bitten tongue. The slabs exuded a smell of copper mingled with old linen left too long in a shuttered chest, a scent both intimate and unsettling, like brushing against the memory of a shroud. The rising sun did nothing to warm the scene. Instead, its first rays slid across the slabs, igniting pale reflections that shimmered as though trapped beneath the surface rather than cast upon it. The light seemed unable to escape, drawn downward and swallowed whole by the frozen plates. The villagers stood in uneasy silence, unsure whether they were witnessing the birth of something new or the slow unveiling of something ancient, something that had waited patiently beneath the winter lake for the moment when its prison would thin and the world above would be forced to see it. The villagers dragged the slabs ashore with a mixture of awe and dread, their breaths quickening each time their palms brushed the unnaturally smooth surfaces. The slabs felt weightless, lighter than any lake ice they had ever lifted, yet when their edges struck the frozen ground, the thud carried the grave finality of iron against stone. Even the strongest among them, men accustomed to hauling timber and wrestling stubborn plow horses, found themselves unsettled by the contradiction. These slabs should have shattered under the rough handling, yet they endured every scrape and drop without so much as a tremor. It was as though the material did not belong to winter or water at all, but to some other domain entirely, one that refracted cold into a form both alien and unyielding. As daylight slipped toward dusk, the shapes within the translucent plates grew sharper. What had begun as spectral outlines thickened into intimate details, the particular curve of a jaw, the faint indentation of a scar, the precise drape of a sleeve. The smith's daughter appeared first, her steady figure captured mid-stride, hands clasped tightly around a bundle of hay she must have intended for the animals still waiting in the byre. Then came the innkeeper's brother, frozen in the mundane act of lifting a wooden pail, his shoulders pitched forward in that familiar way that suggested he had anticipated another hour of chores rather than eternal suspension. The old widow emerged last, her bare feet sinking into invisible snow, her thin arms raised slightly as though she had been preparing to steady herself against a wind that never reached her. These were not strangers nor old legends unearthed from the lake's forgotten depths. They were the missing, the ones who had vanished that very morning, leaving warm hearths, half-cooked meals, and woolen mittens drying on pegs. No footprints led away from their homes. No tracks suggested abduction or flight. They had simply ceased to be. And now they reappeared here, embalmed in something clearer than ice, as if the lake had claimed them in a single, silent breath. A faint glow stirred within the slabs as twilight thickened. It began as a smoldering thread of pale blue, slowly weaving its way through the frozen depths. The villagers watched in muted terror as the radiance brightened whenever a living person drew near, as though the slabs recognized warmth and resented it. The glow flickered like a pulse, slow at first, then quickening in brief bursts that suggested an icy mimicry of desire or hunger. Some villagers stepped back instinctively, feeling the cold intensify with each inhalation, as if the slabs sought to draw the heat from their lungs through the simple act of proximity. Children were kept far from the makeshift line of glimmering plates bordering the shore. Mothers clutched their little ones close, hurrying them indoors, whispering prayers learned in childhood and rarely uttered in the presence of neighbors. Even the elders, who claimed to have seen every strange omen winter could conjure, found themselves glancing over their shoulders, fearing that the faces in the slabs might shift again, that the frozen features might rearrange into expressions no human mouth could form. As night finally claimed the sky, the slabs released a slow, creeping mist. It rose from the etched faces like exhalations dredged up from a deep, suffocating sleep. The mist carried a smell that fingers of frost could not disguise, the sour, leathery stench of rotting hides left out during the bitter stretch between late autumn and early winter, when decay persists beneath the cold and seeps through the seams of storage sheds. It clung to the air with a stubbornness that made even the most stoic villagers gag and turn away. Yet the mist did not disperse. Instead, it hovered in place, drifting along the ground in low, creeping tendrils that curled around boots and skirts before retreating toward the slabs, as if reluctant to stray far from the faces imprisoned there. Some thought they saw movement within the mist, fleeting shadows that resembled hands reaching outward, or lips trembling as though straining to speak. Others insisted the mist was simply reacting to the shifting temperature of the night, though their trembling voices betrayed disbelief in the very logic they offered. One young herdsman claimed he saw the old widow's eyelids flutter, but his friends silenced him before his words could travel far. No one wished to imagine that the frozen figures were aware of their watchers, or worse, that they were listening. By the time the last lanterns were extinguished and the villagers retreated to their homes, the slabs pulsed steadily with that eerie blue light. It illuminated the shoreline in a ghostly semicircle, casting long shadows that stretched across the snow like dark, reaching limbs. From a distance, the plates resembled a congregation waiting for some unspoken ritual, a gathering of silent witnesses rising from the lake to claim their place along the edge of the world. The villagers barred their doors and drew their curtains tight, but even thick walls and heavy quilts could not keep out the sense that something cold and watchful lingered just beyond the threshold. Throughout the night, the mist continued to seep from the slabs, creeping along the ground in a restless dance. It curled beneath door frames, slid through cracks in window panes, and wound itself around sleeping figures like a chill-ridden whisper. By dawn's first light, a thin layer of frost coated the inner walls of nearly every home, shimmering faintly in the gray morning hush. No one dared speculate whether the frost had come from the lake or from the eyes of the trapped figures themselves. No one dared admit the deeper fear threading through their hearts, that the missing had not been taken by misfortune or wandering spirit, but had been claimed by the lake for reasons as deliberate as they were unfathomable. And the slabs, glowing ever brighter with their jealous, frozen hunger, seemed less like memorials and more like warnings, cold proclamations that the lake had awakened, and it would not close itself again. A feverish fear gripped Novgorod as more plates surfaced, rising from the lake bed one by one, arranged in a wide and deliberate circle that no shifting current could have shaped. They emerged with the slow authority of something ancient reclaiming its place, each slab ascending through the ice as though guided by a steady, unseen hand. The villagers gathered in uneasy clusters along the shoreline, watching with hollowed eyes as the circle widened, its circumference growing with each new plate that pressed upward. The slabs gleamed with that unnatural clarity, brighter than the weak winter sun and indifferent to its pallid light, their surfaces catching the dawn like polished bone. No one dared to cross the perimeter they formed. Even the boldest hunters, men accustomed to tracking wolves through waist-high snow and fending off starvation in the harshest years, stopped short as though faced with a boundary forged not of ice, but of judgment. The oldest among them whispered that this lake had once been a place of punishment during the days of feuds, so ancient they no longer bore dates. Only stories murmured around the hearth. They spoke of chieftains who sealed the guilty beneath winter's glassy lid, casting them into the freezing depths where the weight of the season served as both shroud and tomb. Names had been erased there, they said, swallowed by a justice colder and more enduring than any blade. Most dismissed such tales as the frayed remnants of folklore, but now, as the slabs surfaced in their perfect circle, those old stories seemed less like fables and more like warnings neglected for too many generations. Guilt, the elders insisted, had a long memory. And something beneath the ice had begun to remember with a hunger sharpened by centuries of silence. The villagers noticed first that the slabs no longer appeared inert. Within their frozen clarity, subtle motions twisted like faint ripples shifting under glass. The faces trapped within did not move, yet the ice around them churned in slow spirals, as though something deep inside were beginning to unmake itself. The centers of the slabs grew cloudy, thickening into a milky haze that pulsed outward in threads. Then the melting began, not from sun or fire, but from within, as if the slabs themselves rejected the forms they held. It happened quietly at first. A single droplet formed in the very heart of one plate, a trembling bead of liquid cradled in the cold. Then the droplet widened, spiraling outward with eerie deliberation. The villagers stepped back as the transformation spread, plate after plate softening from its core. The ice melted not into water but into thick, slow droplets that glowed with a cold luminescence, each droplet sliding in deliberate paths like veins unraveling from the center. As the inner spirals liquefied, the slabs exhaled. Thin puffs of freezing vapor escaped through new cracks in the surface, quiet sighs that drifted upward and then bent toward the earth as though reluctant to leave. Each cloud of vapor twisted into a distinct shape, a faint echo of the frozen face trapped within the slab. The smith's daughter appeared in ghostly outline first, her figure breaking apart into tendrils of cold mist that coiled around themselves before dissolving. Then came the shepherd, his spectral form bending like smoke caught in a jar. One by one, the echoes formed and then dissipated, each vanishing with a shiver as though erased by an unseen hand. The villagers watched in horrified stillness as these vaporous apparitions drifted across the shore. The mist did not behave like fog, but like memory, intentional, transient, and hauntingly precise. Some tendrils brushed against boots or skirts. The cold they imparted numbed instantly, biting deeper than the winter air ever could. Those who had been touched spoke in hushed tones of a sensation like fingers gripping their ankles or wrists, cold and desperate, as though pleading to be pulled back into the world of the living. With every new plate that began its inward collapse, the circle on the lake grew brighter. The glow was no longer a faint pulse but a steadily rising radiance that illuminated the snow from beneath, casting long shadows across the shore in shapes that did not quite match the people standing there. The air thickened with tension, as though the lake were drawing breath in preparation for something vast and inevitable. Animals refused to approach. Horses reared and bolted, dogs whimpered and pressed themselves against doorways, and the crows that usually scavenged near the frozen reeds took flight in frantic, spiraling patterns before abandoning the lake entirely. Some villagers begged the elders to intervene with rituals half-remembered, with prayers never meant for daylight. Others insisted that the slabs were not omens but punishments, that the missing must have sinned in ways too terrible to speak. But most remained silent, caught between dread and resignation, feeling the weight of something old pressing upon their town like a slow descending hand. As night fell, the melting spirals widened and the vapor thickened, drifting in low, wavering sheets across the surface of the lake. The echoes of the trapped faces grew less distinct, stretched thin like memories fading under frost. Yet the slabs themselves glowed brighter still, blazing with an icy clarity that forced the villagers to shield their eyes. It was clear that the lake was not finished. It had collected its new names, and now, awakened at last, it had begun to open. The townsfolk attempted to destroy the slabs when fear outpaced reason, gathering at the lakeshore with axes, iron hammers, and the grim resolve born from sleepless nights. They swung with all the strength that frozen muscles and trembling nerves could muster, striking at the plates with blows meant to shatter stone. But each impact rang back at them with the sonorous resonance of a cathedral bell submerged beneath deep water, a muted yet immense sound that vibrated through ribs and cartilage. The tools rebounded violently, sending shocks up their arms, leaving palms numb and elbows aching. Not a single fracture appeared. The slabs absorbed every strike with unsettling patience, as though indulging the attacks of the living the way one humored a frightened child. When the townsfolk paused to catch their breath, the plates responded with a shifting so subtle that many denied witnessing it. The etched faces, once stiff and frozen into unchanging expressions, began to move in minute, dreadful increments. Eyes widened by scarcely more than a fraction, yet the motion was undeniable. Lips parted ever so slightly, revealing hints of teeth or forming shapes that suggested the first breath after drowning. Nose and cheekbone adjusted with the faint elasticity of softening wax. Though no sound escaped them, the plates emitted an impression of whispering, a sensation that crawled along the skin rather than entered through the ears. Some villagers staggered back, pressing gloved hands to their mouths as nausea rippled through them, convinced the faces were tasting the cold air, testing its texture like creatures newly awakened. The lake seemed to sense their panic. Its surface, long still in winter-esque grasp, trembled beneath its crust, shifting in slow, rolling pulses. The ice swelled and dipped in nearly imperceptible motions at first, like a sleeping beast turning in slumber. Then the tremors strengthened, sending ripples of muted thunder sweeping outward from the circle of slabs. These vibrations ran along the ice in jagged patterns, cracking the thin frost that had accumulated overnight and shaking snow loose from the rafters of lakeside homes. Wooden beams groaned under the pressure, releasing tiny cascades of ice crystals that fell like brittle confetti onto tables, beds, and startled inhabitants who thought the shaking a herald of collapse. Those closest to the shore felt something even more alarming, a pressure rising beneath their floors. It came on slowly, a soft thud at first, like the pulse of a buried drum. Then the pressure expanded, swelling upward with a cold so dense it seemed to have weight, pressing against the floorboards in rhythmic surges. The boards bowed slightly, creaking under the strain. In one house, a jug slid from a shelf and shattered on the ground. In another, a pair of boots toppled from their hooks. The sensation conjured a visceral image in every mind. The impression that something below was learning to beat, a heart buried under ice and earth pushing upward with each strengthening pulse. Panic spread quickly. Families fled their homes, clutching children in blankets, convinced the ground might split beneath them. A few villagers dropped to their knees and begged the slabs for mercy, their voices cracking in the cold air. Others implored the elders for guidance, though the elders themselves stared at the trembling lake with expressions drained of certainty. The ancient stories they carried offered no script for this moment. Those tales spoke of guilty souls sealed beneath winter, but nothing had ever been told about what might happen once the imprisoned stirred. The slabs grew brighter as the tremors intensified. Their inner glow, once a pale thread-like pulse, strengthened into a steady azure radiance that spilled over the snow in long, trembling ribbons. The faces within grew clearer with each wave of light. Some appeared anguished, mouths strained in silent cries. Others looked eerily calm, as though resigned to the transformation unfolding inside the ice. The townsfolk could not agree whether the expressions reflected suffering or longing, or some complex state between the two, beyond human comprehension. Then came the sound. It began as a low vibration, barely distinguishable from the wind. But unlike wind, it did not move. It hung in the air, swelling in resonance, the pitch rising until it formed a sustained, trembling note. It resembled the hum of a vast bow drawn slowly across the strings of an unseen instrument buried beneath the lake. Snow loosened from rooftops and slid noiselessly to the ground as the sound expanded, filling every cavity, every lung, every hollow space. The villagers clutched their chests, feeling the vibration inside their ribs, as though their own hearts were being coaxed to sync with the buried rhythm pressing upward from the depths. When the note finally tapered off, silence fell with shocking weight. The lake stilled. The tremors paused. Even the mist that had drifted from the melting cores of the slabs seemed to suspend itself in idle hesitation, as though waiting for a cue. The villagers held their breath, too terrified to move. Then the slabs gave one unified pulse, bright, sharp, and unmistakably deliberate. It was not an ending. It was a response, and it marked the moment the lake acknowledged the attempts to silence it. By the fifth night, the lake no longer behaved as water in any sense the villagers recognized. Its surface had taken on a grotesque flexibility, curving upward in long, swelling arches that rose like the dome of a giant lung straining for breath. The ice bowed higher with each expansion, creaking under the pressure, then deflated in slow, suffocating exhales that sent thin fractures skittering across its surface like frantic insects seeking escape. The sound was unnervingly organic, a wet groan that did not belong to frozen water, but to something trapped beneath it, something forcing itself toward the world above through sheer, unrelenting will. From the deepest fissures, more plates drifted upward, but these differed from the earlier slabs in ways that drew gasps from even the most hardened villagers. No faces stared from within them. Instead, foggy silhouettes filled the crystal depths, smeared and shifting as though viewed through smoke. Entire streets appeared in those blurred shapes, recognizable despite their distortion. The slanted roof of the bakery, the crooked fence by the tannery, the narrow lane where children chased each other through mud in warmer seasons. One plate showed the square itself, though the figures moving through it were not people but phantoms of buildings, chimneys, gates and corridors drifting like memories half-formed. It was as if the lake had begun memorizing the town, consuming its contours, swallowing its structures piece by piece, and rendering them as reflections carved into frozen glass. News spread rapidly, and by dusk the villagers had abandoned the trembling lakeshore altogether. They gathered instead in the square, huddling under layers of wool and sheepskin, shivering not from the wind, which had fallen into an uncanny stillness, but from the oppressive calm settling over the land. The air carried no scent of smoke, though dozens of chimneys exhaled pale trickles moments before. Even the snowflakes seemed to hesitate mid-fall, drifting in irregular motions, drawn toward the lake as though pulled by a breath too faint to hear. No animal sounds reached the square. The dogs had vanished into barns, the oxen refused to leave their stalls, and the crows had not returned since the third night. The town felt suspended, as though poised on the brink of a transformation none dared articulate. The villagers whispered in tight voices, their breaths forming clouds that hovered unnaturally, refusing to dissipate. Children clung to their parents with a fear too instinctive to be soothed. Elders clutched amulets once meant only for birthbed blessings and burial rites. Every ear strained toward the lake, waiting for the next groan, the next tremor, the next sign that the boundary between ice and earth had thinned to a final, fatal membrane. Then the ground itself shuddered, throwing a metallic crack across the night. The crowd turned as one toward the lake, just as its center convulsed outward. Ice shattered upward, not in shards, but in a single cataclysmic heave that sent a plume of frost spiraling into the sky. Through this eruption rose the final plate, enormous beyond comprehension. It emerged vertically, as though lifted by invisible hands with ceremonial precision. Taller than any house in Novgorod, broad as a fortress gate, it ascended with a cold radiance that bled into the clouds, casting a pale illumination across the entire region. The plate was clear as polished crystal, unmarred by cracks or imperfections. Icicles dangled from its edges like suspended daggers, refracting slivers of moonlight into shimmering arcs across the snow. The surface gleamed with such unnatural purity that the villagers were forced to shield their eyes. But what lay at its center drew them irresistibly back. Within the monolith shimmered the faint outline of the entire town, not as a reflection cast by lantern light, but as a fully formed miniature, suspended with impossible clarity. Streets curved inside the slab, each roof and alley rendered in delicate threads of frost. The marketplace stalls stood in miniature rows. The church tower glimmered like a needle of ice. Even the town walls appeared in shrunken contours, bending inward at their corners. And as the villagers watched in horrified silence, the miniature town began to shrink. It drew inward with slow, deliberate grace, collapsing not in ruin but in compression, folding into itself as though being consumed by an invisible spiral. The outlines blurred, then tightened, then receded further until shapes dissolved into ghostly ripples of pale blue. The monolith pulsed once, an almost gentle contraction, before settling into a steady, chilling stillness. Some villagers fell to their knees, convinced they had witnessed the lake claim the soul of Novgorod itself. Others turned away, unable to bear the sight of their world swallowed so methodically. A few reached out trembling hands toward the towering slab, only to recoil as the cold radiating from it pressed against their skin with the force of a living thing. The plate stood silent and monumental, as though waiting for something still unfolding within its depths. And as the villagers stared, they understood with visceral certainty that the lake was no longer reflecting the town. It was replacing it. At dawn of the sixth day, when the horizon was still washed in the pale violet of unrisen sunlight, the plates that had towered over the lake gave their final performance. They did not shatter. They did not sink. Instead, they folded inward with a strange, fluid grace, bending like soft wax before collapsing into a perfect ring of slush. The slush steamed in the frigid air, sending up thin ribbons of vapor that twisted and curled as if performing a slow, ceremonial dance. Then came a single exhalation, long, resonant, almost relieved, the sigh of something ancient settling back into sleep. It rolled across the empty landscape like a final benediction, and for a fleeting moment, the villagers who were no longer present to hear it might have imagined the lake expressing gratitude, or mourning, or both. When the vapor thinned and the first weak rays of dawn touched the basin, the lake revealed its new form. Its surface, once domed and heaving like the chest of a restless animal, now lay flat, still, and impossibly smooth. A flawless expanse of pale blue ice stretched from shore to shore, unblemished by even the faintest crack. No seams remained where the plates had risen. No fissures hinted at the terrifying violence of the previous nights. It looked untouched, preserved in a purity that defied memory itself. Even the snow around the waterline seemed arranged with unnatural precision, its drifts unnaturally even, as though combed by an unseen hand. But where the town had stood, where homes had leaned into one another with the intimacy of old friendships, where barns and workshops had sprawled across the fields, where generations had carved paths into the earth, there was nothing. No charred ruins, no collapsed beams, not even footprints. The land was empty, wiped bare with a meticulousness that felt colder than winter. Wind drifted freely over a blank slate of snow, sweeping across stretches of whiteness that offered no story, no hint that a community had existed there only a handful of days earlier. It was erasure elevated to an art form, a thoroughness that suggested deliberation rather than catastrophe. When travelers passed through weeks later, merchants who knew the routes well, pilgrims who trusted their maps, wanderers who carried more stories than coins, they stopped in bewilderment, certain they had misjudged their distance. They searched for familiar landmarks, the leaning pine by the western path, the chimney spires that once rose above the fields, the worn sign at the crossroads that pointed toward Novgorod. They found only silence. A deep, consuming stillness hung over the lake, so dense that voices fell flat, swallowed by an air that refused to carry sound. Even the crunch of boots on snow seemed muted, as if muffled by thick cloth. Those who ventured closer to the lake's edge felt their breath falter. The cold radiating from the surface was different, heavier, more commanding, a cold that seemed to enter the lungs and settle behind the ribs. Some travelers described the sensation of being observed, not by people, but by the lake itself, as though the water beneath the ice had developed a lingering, patient curiosity. The silence was the kind that made hearts beat louder in the ears, the kind that seemed carved into the very air, leaving no space for birdsong or wind. And then they saw the shapes. Not immediately. At first, they believed the glimmers beneath the ice to be distortions of light, tricks of sun and snow. But patience revealed more. Entire frozen streets appeared below the surface, dim at first, then unmistakable. Rooflines curved in graceful arcs. Lanes twisted into familiar intersections. A cluster of chimneys formed a miniature skyline, preserved in a ghostly palette of blue and white. The shapes lay motionless, suspended deep within the ice, like a town pressed between pages of glass. The travelers approached reverently, drawn to the submerged tableau even as their skin prickled with unease. They knelt, brushing snow from the surface, and found themselves staring down into an intact but unreachable world. They recognized the bakery, though it stood in eerie silence. They spotted the church steeple, bent slightly as memory dictated. They traced the outlines of walls, fences, wells, all perfectly replicated, nothing missing. But no figures moved among the buildings. No breath fogged the frozen streets. The town rested in perfect stillness, preserved as though captured in the final heartbeat before disappearing. Some speculated that the lake had stolen a reflection, imprinting the town onto its surface the way frost records the paths of leaves. Others whispered that the people themselves had been taken down into the cold, that the ice had learned to swallow not just faces, not just memories, but entire lives. The boldest among them pressed their palms to the ice and claimed it pulsed faintly, like a distant, slumbering heart. None stayed long. Those who left carried with them the image of frozen streets waiting in the dark, patient and unchanged. Those who attempted to return found themselves turned around on familiar paths, disoriented by snow and silence until the lake disappeared behind them as though it had never existed at all. And over the basin, winter deepened. The ice thickened. The shapes beneath remained. A stolen reflection that would never thaw.